Corbin Burnes signing with the Diamondbacks has led to a lot of questions, like where will the Orioles go now without their ace from 2024? And will the O's ever bring in a starting pitcher on a long-term deal? Well, I'll try to answer those questions and more from you, the viewers and listeners, coming up on this live mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, December 30th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to be taking your Orioles questions live here on the show. A little live Mailbag Monday edition on a Monday evening. If you are watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But speaking of those comments, put your Orioles questions in the comment section here on the live YouTube stream, and we will get to your questions, hopefully get you some Orioles answers, because there is a lot of talk after Corbin Burnes signed a long-term deal with the Arizona Diamondbacks over the weekend. That was the Orioles' main target. He was their big-time number one ace in 2024. And the question is really, what do the Orioles do next? So again, get those questions in the chat. We will get to them on a mailbag episode. But I do want to start off with kind of a question I've gotten a couple of times from people via email and other places, and just wanted to kind of start the mailbag with this question that's in the title of this video as well, which is, okay, Corbin Burnes signs for 6 years with the Diamondbacks. He's not coming back to Baltimore. Putting that just aside, overall, will the Orioles ever, at least under this Mike Elias regime, sign a pitcher in free agency or even in an extension to a long-term contract? I think it is a fair question to ask at this point. And when I hear that question, I mean, we haven't seen it done yet, obviously, so we do not know the answer. But my first assumption is to lean towards the side of no, because one of the big pillars of what the Houston Astros were able to do when Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and others were there, and they won 2 championships and they did it their own way, and the Orioles have modeled some of what they've done with their rebuild after what Elias was part of in Houston, the Astros really never gave out the big long-term contracts, especially to pitchers. Now, they took on some short-term big money, like with Garrett Cole and Justin Verlander and Zach Greinke, and they even extended some of those guys, but for shorter-term deals, but never gave out that giant bag until really recently. They did like the 4-year deal with Josh Hader, but that was basically with Jim Crane and Craig Biggio taking over, Jeff Bagwell, like taking over that front office, and when the old guard of the Jeff Luhnows and the Mike Elias and the Tallman and the James Click and all those guys were out already. And I just feel like the way Elias has operated, both during the rebuild and now in this Orioles team is a winning ball club once again, and how they've operated things, and things could change, obviously. We still haven't seen a full offseason of David Rubenstein as the owner. We don't want to judge them too harshly until we've seen one full Rubenstein offseason to see, okay, what kind of money are they going to spend? But from everything Elias has said since he's taken over the Orioles, it seems like it would fall within his want to, and basically how he wants to run this team, that he wouldn't be a big fan of a long-term deal, especially for a pitcher, because pitchers are so risky. They get injured so often. They tend not to age very well at times. And so you could see why he would be backing away from giving a long-term deal to a pitcher in his 30s. Like, there's a lot of sense behind that potentially being the decision that the Orioles would make. But I did jump in, and again, I lean no, they may never give out the long-term deal, and maybe if they do, it would be to their own guys, right? Because they know a lot more about the medicals and the development of their own guys. So maybe when a Kyle Bradish or a Grayson Rodriguez gets closer to free agency, that is maybe when they would give out a longer-term deal to a pitcher to keep that guy around, but they feel it's too risky. Now, we know the Orioles made a competitive offer to Corbin Burnes. We don't quite know what that offer was. It would seem like it was in the realm of $175 million money-wise. We, although don't know how many years they would have offered. I doubt they offered more than 5, and my guess it was probably a 4-year, $160 to $70-ish million deal if I had to guess here. But I just wanted to look at some of the biggest contracts pitchers have gotten recently, and ones that have either fully played out or have almost fully played out at this point, to see, okay, when you have a top flight starting pitcher like Corbin Burnes is, and this is separate of the Corbin Burnes conversation, because Burnes is a really interesting case where he clearly wanted to play in Arizona for the Diamondbacks and be near his family over anything else. And the D-backs weren't really interested. And the reporting is Scott Boras went to Ken Kendrick, the Diamondbacks owner, and basically said, Corbin Burnes wants to play here. Do you have the money to give him? And the Diamondbacks said, oh, he does? Well, we kind of do. Here's $210 million. Burnes said, yes, don't care about my other offers, even though he was offered more money by other teams, and took that deal. So it's a very special circumstance. But Corbin Burnes is a top 10 starting pitcher in baseball right now, and has been, I think, a top 5 starting pitcher in baseball over the past 5 years. Like, this is a Cy Young winner. He just started the All-Star game. This is one of the true aces in the game. So I looked at some of the deals that some of those true aces in the game have gotten over the last 10 or 15 years. And these are all the contracts that are involved, are one of the top 50 contracts in terms of total value ever given out in Major League Baseball. And among pitchers whose contract is already run out or is about to, there were 8 pitchers in this category in the top 50 contracts where we've already seen the entire contract play out. So we're at the end and we kind of know how it went for that team. So I'm going to go in reverse order. The first one I want to talk about is Steven Strasburg. Now, he signed a 7-year, $245 million deal in 2020 when he was 31 years old with the Nationals. He had just come off pitching them to a World Series victory. Now, Strasburg is the most dire case of them all, the one that would scare teams off the most. He only pitched for 3 more seasons, and he barely pitched. He threw 31 1/3 total innings over the next 3 years, had all the arm issues and the neck issues and whatever it was, and hasn't pitched since 2022, has officially retired. He basically gave the Nationals nothing of those 7 years, $245 million. Now, that was a lot of bad injuries that a guy got, but that's going to generally scare you away. David Price in 2016 was 30 years old. And again, for context, Corbin Burnes is 30 years old and coming off another really good season. David Price got 7 years, $217 million. Now, he played out that entire 7 years, except for he did opt out of the 2020 COVID season. So really, I guess he only played 6 of the 7 years. But he had a 3.78 ERA in that stretch. Not too bad. He did, though, start to decline, and 2016 and 2018, the first and third years of the contract, were his only full seasons. He started declining and getting hurt. He was still solid by the end, but was more of a reliever the last 2 years. It didn't go amazing. Zach Greinke in 2016, he was 32 years old, got a 6-year, $206 million deal. And he did become kind of more of a slightly above league average pitcher the final 2 years of the deal. But the first 4 years, he was still Zach Greinke. And honestly, I feel like that deal worked out really well for the Diamondbacks and then for the Astros, who traded for him at the end of the deal. Max Scherzer is basically the opposite of the Steven Strasburg deal. In 2015, at age 30, he signed for 7 years, $191 million with the Nationals. He was awesome for all 7 years. 6 All-Star games, 2 Cy Young Awards, never tailed off, was an ace the entire time. That is like the gold standard of these pitcher contracts. Felix Hernandez, 2013, was a little younger, 27 years old, got 7 years, $175 million to stay with the Mariners. 4 great seasons where he still looked like King Felix. Then 3 really, really, really bad seasons at the end of that deal. So that one was kind of 50-50. Cole Hamels in 2012, he was 28 years old, got 8 years, $173 million. He was pretty good and pretty healthy the whole time. He only went to 2 All-Star games in those 8 years, so he wasn't the old Cole Hamels, but he was still a good pitcher. And at the end of the day, it ended up being worth it because he was productive and he stayed healthy for 8 years. Justin Verlander in 2010, age 27, got 10 years, $219 million. Had that one bad year, you remember, in 2014, but otherwise was great the whole time. Another one of the gold standards of these long-term pitcher deals. And then the last one is CC Sabathia in 2009. He was 28 years old, got 9 years, $202 million from the Yankees. 4 great years, 3 bad ones, and then 2 good ones at the end. But CC had the extenuating circumstances. He struggled with alcoholism, we know, in kind of the middle of that deal and with his weight, and had some injuries and kind of got his life and his baseball career back on track at the end. So if you're looking through those, like, I would say only 2 of them went poorly. Steven Strasburg, obviously a disaster, and then David Price didn't go how they wanted it to, but he was still productive for some of those years. But I would still say that went poorly. You could say Felix Hernandez went poorly because he had the 3 really bad seasons at the end. And I guess you could say CC's went poorly because it was bad in the middle, but in the most pessimistic viewpoint of these 8 contracts, 4 good and 4 bad. And I would put it at 5 good and 3 bad. And these are the top flight pitchers that are in the category of Corbin Burnes. I just look at all that to say, yes, it is very risky to give out a long-term, big money deal to a starting pitcher. They break and they break, and they're breaking more now than they ever have. But generally, when you have these special talents, those deals still can work out more often than not. And again, Burnes was a separate conversation. He wanted to play for the Diamondbacks. But if another deal like that were to come along, it's just to say the Orioles should not be so risk averse. I'm just worried that they will be in this Mike Elias regime. But thank you to the multiple people who sent in that question. Now we'll get to all the ones coming up in the comments. Thank you so much for putting in some Orioles questions. We are going to get to them in just a moment. But first, our first quick break of the episode. And that break is to tell you about Rocket Money. Yes, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Well, that definitely happened for me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for. And Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions or spending habits or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. It's literally, again, like having an assistant. I don't want to make a phone call. Some of these subscriptions, you got to make a phone call to cancel them. I don't want to make a phone call. Rocket Money can do all the dirty work for you to get that canceled. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. One more time, it's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by DK Law Group. When you need a law firm, do you want the legal runaround or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with DK Law Group. DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech savvy, they treat clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple. And one of the things you'll quickly notice with DK Law Group is their transparent pricing. They believe in clarity and cost and that no one should be left in limbo. So contact DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. And Locked On Orioles listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline, Empowering Legacies. So we are back here on a live Mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Thank you to everyone who has sent in your questions so far. Again, if you have Orioles questions for the Mailbag and you're watching live here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, make sure to put them in the chat. We're going to try to get to most of, if not all of them, on tonight's Monday episode. Let's start with a question from Steven, who asks, if the Orioles need to deal some of their position players to acquire an ace, how likely are they to pursue a position player via free agency to replace them? Would that make Pete Alonso an Orioles option? Good question, Steven, because there's a chance that the Orioles are able to go and get an ace-type pitcher via trade, which is pretty much where they're at now. Like, those kind of guys are no longer available in free agency. If they want to get a top-of-the-rotation guy, it's going to have to be a trade. The Dylan Ceases, the Luis Castillos, the Pablo Lopez's, Framber Valdez's, potentially of the world who are out there. And they could have to deal from their major league surplus of position players, whether a team would want a Ryan Mountcastle or a Heston Kjerstad or someone like that. Those are players who definitely could be involved in that deal. Now, for me, I think there's only one free agent position player still out there on the market who could have a potential to come to Baltimore if a trade like this is made. And that, to me, is Anthony Santander, who is still out there, who is still reportedly asking for 5 years, who still reportedly wants to come back to Baltimore and is not getting what he's asking for when teams are giving him offers in free agency. They don't want to give him a 5-year deal. So if his money slips down to closer to the 3 years, $60 million range in free agency, I think if the Orioles had to move either Kjerstad or Mountcastle in a deal, that would have space open up for Santander, even with Tyler O'Neill here, to still be on this team. I think Kjerstad more likely than Mountcastle, because if you move Mountcastle, you could just push Kobe Mayo right into that role. But either way, Santander is a guy who's going to stay healthy and he's going to produce for you at the plate and give you a power bat in the middle. If his price is coming down and the O's do make a trade that involves Mountcastle or Kjerstad, I don't think they'd be a player for anyone like Pete Alonso. But Santander coming back, if his price drops, I think could certainly happen there. And that leads right into the next question from Chase, who asks, what do you think the chances are that Ryan Mountcastle and Heston Kjerstad are traded for pitching? If you were ranking players who are currently on the 40-man roster, position player-wise, who I think are most likely to be traded for starting pitching, Kjerstad and Mountcastle would be my number 1 and 2 on that list for the Orioles. So I think if the O's do go get starting pitching and the other team wants major league ready bats, Kjerstad and Mountcastle are going to be the first 2 guys that the Orioles throw out there. Because again, you have 3 outfielders with Mullins, Cowser, and O'Neill right now. And you have first baseman with O'Hearn and Mayo on this roster. Those guys, at least on roster fit, are certainly expendable to a point for the Orioles right now. Zachariah with a question here. Is there a chance of a Dylan Cease or Luis Castillo trade that would also include an extension? That is a good question. Now, these are 2 separate pitchers in that category. For Dylan Cease, he only has 1 year remaining. He is a free agent after 2025. I think the Orioles are going to be interested in trying to trade for him. The issue is Cease is a Scott Boras client. And as we know, Scott Boras did not love his clients taking extensions before they hit free agency, especially Dylan Cease, who's an ace potential kind of guy who could get big money if he pitches well in 2025. So even if the O's got him, they could bring him back in free agency, but I don't see there being like an in-season extension. I think the O's would have to wait till after the season and then try to bring him back. For Castillo, it's kind of unneeded because Luis Castillo still has 3 more years remaining on his deal for 2025, 26, and 27. And there's a vesting option for 2028. So theoretically, you could get Castillo with 4 years of team control remaining. So there's really no need for the extension in that spot. I've got to answer this question from Hunter, although it's not an Orioles question. Hunter asking, Terps number 24, men's basketball, are we underrated? Yes, the Terps are underrated. They're only number 24 in the coaches poll. The haters of the AP poll are still not ranking Maryland, even though they're number 11 in KenPom right now, I believe. Yes, that team is legit. I saw them live at the Barclays Center last weekend, just dismantle Syracuse. Underrated for sure. Absolutely for sure. Zachariah with another question here. Where do the Orioles rank in terms of American League teams right now? I think that is a good question. If you're just looking at the current state of the roster that the Orioles are sending out there, I would say even without Juan Soto, the Yankees have a better roster. With adding Max Fried, they got Rodon, they got Cole, they still have Aaron Judge. They have a better roster. If I'm looking in the AL East, I'd still take the Orioles over the Blue Jays and over the Rays. Red Sox is tough because Crochet was a good addition. We'll see about Buehler. They've got some young hitters coming up. That one's a toss-up for me. If you go to the AL West, I would take the Orioles over the Angels, over the A's, and honestly, I would take them over the Astros, especially without Bregman in the conversation, without Kyle Tucker in the conversation. I'm taking them over the Astros. I would take the Orioles over the Mariners because I don't believe in their lineup at all. Rangers have a really good lineup, and they have DeGrom. I'd take Rangers and Yankees over the Orioles. And then in the AL Central, not the White Sox, not the Guardians, not the Tigers. Honestly, even though they beat the Orioles, not the Royals, and not the Twins. So if you're just looking at on-paper rosters, I'll say Yankees, Red Sox, Rangers are the only ones that I feel clearly have better rosters right now than the Orioles. That kind of puts it into perspective. Even without Corbin Burnes, like this is a really, really talented team at this point. Let's see. We got a question here from Orioles Birdwatcher. Hey, Connor, fans are restless. I think the offseason could still be a success. 3 things. Trade for the starting pitcher we need. Splash free agent with Tanner Scott as the 1-2 punch in the bullpen. And while we wait, lock up Jordan Westberg. Do you think that would work? Are all 3 things realistic? Trading for the starting pitcher we need, I think, is realistic. And I think it would flip the entire outlook of this offseason from fans right now. A splash free agent with Tanner Scott as the 1-2 punch in the bullpen, assuming that means Scott with Bautista as the 1-2 punch. I don't see the Orioles spending the amount of money it might take to get Tanner Scott, and especially a Tanner Scott who they know very well. He was an Oriole for a long time before they traded into the Marlins, and he kind of found how to throw it in the strike zone for the first time in his career. I think the Tanner Scott one is the least realistic. I think locking up Westberg is in theory a possibility. He's kind of the perfect player you would want to extend. The issue is Westberg is also a Scott Boras client. As we have talked about already, Scott Boras generally is not advising his clients to take early extensions. So if I were to rank them from most to least likely, I would say trading for a top line starting pitcher would be most likely. Then I'd say Westberg and then Tanner Scott, just because even though it's Scott Boras, maybe they get the right deal done. I really don't see the Orioles bringing back Tanner Scott. Let's see. Hunter with another question here. This is non-Maryland basketball related. Hunter, offline, we can chat about just how good Jacoby Gillespie is. But Hunter asks, is this the, quote, we're not stopping at McDonald's, we have food at home scenario? And we think we have an ace in either Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, or Kyle Bradish. I think, and it all, again, we're answering this question. We're only about halfway through the offseason. There's still pitchers out there. There's trades to be made. Remember, the Corbin Burnes trade was made on February 1st last offseason. So there's still time for the Orioles to make a huge splash. But if they don't add another top flight starting pitcher, there is some of this there because the Orioles have believed ever since they drafted him back in 2018 out of high school that Grayson Rodriguez has ace potential. And they thought that all through the minors, and they have thought that in his last couple years in the majors. Now, we haven't seen him stay fully healthy and pitch a full season yet. We got to see a full major league season from Rodriguez first. With Bradish, he finished fourth in AL Cy Young voting in 2023. We've seen it, but he's coming back from Tommy John, and I think the best case scenario for Bradish is like a mid-August return. I don't think we're getting a lot of Kyle Bradish in 2025. So you can't really bank on him. And then for Eflin, I love Zach Eflin, but remember, he's a free agent after 2025. I'd like to see the Orioles maybe work out an extension where they can tack on 2 more years to the end of that deal. But right now, you can't count on any of those three. And maybe they are. I think it's a possibility this is the truth, Hunter. But you haven't seen a full season from Rodriguez. You're not getting much Bradish at all this year, and you may not have any Eflin at all after this year. So you can't count on any of those guys to be the long-term ace just yet. Now, we could get to 6 months from now and be like, Bradish is on track and Rodriguez looks amazing and Eflin got extended. And we're like, you know what? We're good. But you can't feel that right now. The Orioles would have to give us another sign that that's the case. And I think maybe a little Zach Eflin extension could be a sign there that they do have that ace at home. Hank to Hendricks with the question. I think Pablo Lopez would be perfect. Hank, I am on board with you there. What players do you think the O's would need to trade to make this happen? So for context, Pablo Lopez of the Minnesota Twins, who was originally a Miami Marlin, and was someone that the Orioles were at least engaged with the Marlins at one point for trade talks. He was then dealt to the Twins for Luis Arraez. Pablo Lopez has 3 years remaining on his contract. He'll be a free agent after 2027. He is due to make about $22 million for each of the next 3 seasons. So in terms of what ace-level starting pitching costs, $22 million per year for the next 3 years for Pablo Lopez, that is not super expensive. Now for Lopez, he's 28 years old, and last year stuff was a little bit down. He did, though, throw 32 starts each of the last 3 seasons. Like there's not really been injury concerns with Lopez. 3 straight years, 180 plus innings, 3 straight years, 32 starts, 3.75, 3.66, 4.08 were his last 3 ERAs. Now, last year his strikeouts went down, but he had a 5.3% walk rate, which is super, super low. I really, really like Pablo Lopez. I think it would be a perfect fit for the Orioles. You get 3 years of team control. You get a guy who's not super expensive at $22 million a year. This would be a perfect fit for the O's. I'm not giving up Samuel Basallo, but I think you would have to include Coby Mayo in that trade plus more. And so if the Orioles are willing to give up Coby Mayo plus more, I think they can go get Pablo Lopez. The question is, are you willing to do that kind of deal? That is truly the question. Adit with the question here, is Roki Sasaki to the Padres a necessity for a Dylan Cease to the Orioles trade? I'm going to say no. So Roki Sasaki, it seems like the Padres and the Dodgers at this point are the favorites. They have both met with him already. Now, the Padres rotation right now, in terms of what Roster Resource says on Fangraphs, it's Dylan Cease, Michael King, Yu Darvish, Randy Vasquez, and Matt Waldron Although I'm not really sure Matt Waldron truly has that spot. Now, Joe Musgrove got Tommy John surgery, so they don't have him next year. You kind of start looking at their AAA depth. They do have some pitchers down there that could maybe help them. Obviously, Juan Nunez is in the conversation. Johnny Brito is in the conversation. Like, they've got some interesting guys, Jackson Wolf, Jared Kolar, who are in AAA right now. Ryan Bergert as well, Omar Cruz. Like, there's some guys that I think they like, but I don't really think they need Sasaki to trade Cease. I think they'd like to have Sasaki to trade Cease, but I think the Cease trade is more about money because of all those deals that the Padres gave out. And then Peter Seidler, tragically passed away. They kind of are in a weird money situation. They have a lot of money committed to a lot of players, and they're trying to shed some payroll at this point. And one way to potentially shed that payroll is to trade away players who are expensive and are on the last years of their deals. So Dylan Cease is going to be due $14 million next year, and he's going to be a free agent after the year. And the Padres, they just aren't going to have the money to re-sign Cease. So that's, I think, more why they would be looking to trade him rather than, making sure they have another number one type potentially in the rotation. We're going to get to plenty more questions. Do not worry. Continue to put your Orioles questions here in the chat, but we're going to take one more quick break before we do that. Told you that break, at least if you're watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, was going to be quick. Continue to get your Orioles mailbag questions into the chat. We will continue to answer those here. Let's see. We've got some chatting about Zach Greinke. We've got some bots in the chat. Let's get the bots out of the chat. Let's get some more real people with some real Orioles questions in the chat here. Let's see. Question from Doug Dimmadome. I'm assuming owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome. Where do you think Daz Cameron fits on the Orioles after the Tyler O'Neill signing? I assume he will play against lefty pitchers, moving Cowser to center and just removing Cedric Mullins against lefties in total. Doug, this is interesting because although the Orioles did bring in Daz Cameron as kind of a trade, and he's on the 40-man roster, and it's his second stint in the last 3 years with the Orioles, although he spent all of 2023 or 2023 in AAA with the Orioles. Either way, he never got to the big leagues. Cameron is not guaranteed a roster spot, and a lot of what Daz Cameron could do all depends on what Jorge Mateo can do this year. So we know the Orioles tried Mateo a little bit in center field last year before he got injured. I think the Orioles want a right-handed hitting, kind of fast utility outfielder. And with the way their roster plays out and trying to get Jackson Holliday and Ramon Arias and Jorge Mateo and Kobe Mayo spots on this roster, it would be helpful if Jorge Mateo could be the super utility where he could still play shortstop and second base, but can also play the outfield. And we know Mateo hits lefties well, just like what Daz Cameron does. But Mateo, at this point, is a more valuable all-around player in the big leagues than Cameron is. So if Mateo can play center, I think Cameron finds himself in AAA again. If Mateo can't, or Mateo coming back from that elbow surgery, it's TBD whether or not he'll be ready for opening day at this point. If Mateo's not ready for opening day, and this is a little preview of Wednesday's episode where I'm going to do my first opening day roster prediction to start off the new year, I think if Mateo's not ready for opening day, Daz Cameron has an inside track to get that final bench spot for the Orioles. And as long as he has that spot and Mateo is out still with that injury, he would basically just play the outfield against lefties, do some pinch hitting, maybe some pinch running. That would kind of be his role. He's not going to have a huge role in the Orioles if he finds a niche. But again, if Mateo can't really play the outfield, that could potentially be Daz Cameron's opening to get onto this roster. Adit with another question here. If Kyle Bradish is healthy in 2026, which again, the assumption he will be, the hope is they have him back in September of 2025. So it should be a full go for 26. Do you try to extend him after 2026? I kind of like this question because this is something I've talked about. Like, yeah, the Orioles maybe aren't willing to give out long-term deals to pitchers. Who are they going to extend? Who's going to be willing to be extended? Maybe Kyle Bradish is one of those guys. He's a free agent after 2028. So even if you don't have much of him this year, when you get him fully back from Tommy John, you still have 3 more years of Bradish before he hits free agency. And he would, if he's ready to pitch and be healthy in 2026, he would really start to get expensive for those last 2 years, 2027 and 28, before he hits free agency, if he pitches as well as he did before the injury. I would absolutely try to extend him. Now, it all depends, again, on if he's fully healthy and ready to go. But Adit's question has that in there. I'd go for it. See what you can get Bradish to potentially agree to. I think he'd be a perfect guy. If you're down with extending a young pitcher, Kyle Bradish would be my number one guy on that list. Walter with a question here. Where do you think Tyler O'Neill will hit in the Orioles lineup? Does anyone in particular jump out as a good fit for him to hit before or after in the lineup? The only thing I'd say with Tyler O'Neill is I would not want to put him back-to-back in the lineup with Ryan Mountcastle. Now, the two of them, if Mountcastle's still on the team, are going to play in the same lineup a lot because they're both going to play every single time against lefties because they both mash lefties, and that's a lot of what they're there to do. But both guys have high K rates. So whenever they are both in the lineup together, what I wouldn't do is just hit Mountcastle and O'Neill back-to-back. Other than that, I think against lefties, he'll hit third or fourth. He just destroys left-handers. When he's in there against righties, I think we'll see him more in like the 6 spot in the order or the 7 spot, a little further down where he can still produce, but knowing that mashing lefties is really where he needs to be. Arlo with a question, Jackson Holliday 30-30 season, question mark. I don't think it's going to happen, but absolutely sign me up and give me the 30-30 season for Jackson Holliday. Ice 1678 with a question, is a 2027 work stoppage the only hope we have at signing Gunnar Henderson? I think a salary cap or floor is definitely happening, and unfortunately so is a work stoppage. Scott Boras is going to seek $800 million, in my opinion. Ice is all kind of good stuff to talk about. So the current CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, expires, I believe, December 2nd of 2026. So all signs are pointing to the owners locking out the players again. So more than likely, December 3rd, 2026, we're going to go into another lockout. Now, we had that 2 years ago. Luckily, although a lot of the offseason was a lockout, we didn't lose any games. We still had a 162-game 2023 season. But that is always a possibility, and the players are going to fight for no salary cap. The owners are going to fight for a salary cap. MLB Players Association might be the strongest union in the United States, and the salary cap is one of their main things. Like, we're never going to do it. And with a cap comes a floor and vice versa. I just don't think it's coming in. I think it'll be talked about a lot, but I don't think it's coming in. I don't know at this point. Like, yeah, Scott Boras is absolutely going to seek $800 million for Gunnar Henderson. Will he get it? I don't think so. I think Gunnar will be more of like a $600 million player, but still, that is a whole lot of money. Who knows what level David Rubenstein is operating at in 4 years when Gunnar Henderson becomes a free agent? Would a salary cap help the Orioles sign Gunnar Henderson? Absolutely it would. It would help the Orioles sign any kind of player, but the Players Association is not going to go for it. And they have every right to not go for it. They have fought for the ability to not have that salary cap so their salaries can continue to go up. It does play a factor. I guess we'll just kind of see when potentially that lockout does come in 2 years. Matthew with a good question here. Any idea what the Orioles do with the young depth guys? Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Brandon Young, etc. They seem to be in the category of quad A right now. I wouldn't really put any of those guys in quad A. Quad A is a player who's gotten multiple chances at the big league level and just hasn't done well there, but then goes back to AAA and rakes. The perfect encapsulation of a quad A player is Ryan McKenna. Got a bunch of chances in the big leagues, never really found his own, would go back to AAA and rake. Back to the big leagues, back to AAA, really good. That's a quad A player. Povich, 2 stints in the big leagues in his rookie year. McDermott, 1 start. Brandon Young still has not debuted yet. So you got to give these guys a chance to feel things out in the big leagues before you call them quad A players. On this Orioles team, right now, I would slot Cade Povich into the number 5 spot in the rotation. I would say Chase McDermott has an outside chance to win a bullpen spot on opening day. And I think Brandon Young will just be in the Tides rotation to begin the year with the hope of helping the Orioles. I do believe that if they stay healthy, all 3 of these players will pitch for the Baltimore Orioles in 2025. Not sure any of them will become like a top 3 trusted starting pitcher on this team, but you need a lot of starters and they will all help this year. Let's maybe revisit this question this time next year when they've all gotten ample big league time and we can look into a lot more of a sample size for each 3 of these guys. Let's see. Other questions. Only Sports Cards with a question. Even with losing Anthony Santander, not official yet, but seems more than likely that he will sign elsewhere. Do you think our offense will improve with the added experience of the young core? Yeah, I do think that Tyler O'Neill is probably going to produce less than Anthony Santander did last year. I mean, the guy hit 44 home runs. You can only ask so much out of Tyler O'Neill. So I think you take a little step back there, but you also hope you have a healthy Jordan Westburg and a healthy Ramon Arias all year and a healthy Adley Rutschman. I think Adley Rutschman obviously is going to be a bounce back candidate in 2025. And you get all these young players presumably taking a step forward. Not everybody's going to take a step forward, but getting a little bit better. I think in total, the offense could improve because O'Neill is not enough of a step down from Santander where it's like this huge loss. And you're bringing back everything else. Plus, you're potentially getting, you would think, better Jackson Holiday, more experienced, more Heston Kjerstad, more experienced, better Kobe Mayo, more experienced, and a bounce back from Adley Rutschman. I think in the aggregate, the Orioles will have a better offense in 2025 than they did in 2024. Let's see. Stewie Jr. with a question. Who was the last top-tier free agent to choose to come to or stay in Baltimore for an extended amount of time? I don't know about top-tier free agents in terms of guys they extended, like they were able to keep Adam Jones here on a deal and J.J. Hardy here on a deal and guys like that. Obviously, they had the money they gave out to the Alex Cobbs and the Ubaldo Jimenezes and the Chris Davises of the world. You know, different levels. They really haven't had like this drop-dead, giant, big-time free agent since like the 90s, so it's certainly been a while. Orioles Birdwatcher with a question, technically a nose question. Have you heard of my channel yet, Connor? One season in the books, good sign of growing community. I'd like to have you on as a guest sometime. Possible? Yeah, of course possible. Let's do it. Shoot me an email, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. I don't just Orioles podcast at the Locked On Orioles podcast. I talk about the Orioles elsewhere. Orioles Birdwatcher has another question. Last question, not a fan of Montgomery really, but we don't have a lefty right now. Provided Povich doesn't make the rotation, would you be interested in it if, and only if, the Diamondbacks ate a chunk of that contract? That is Jordan Montgomery, who, of course, was signed to that 2-year deal late in spring training last year by the D-backs. He got injured. He couldn't get ready for the season. It was a complete disaster. The D-backs owner came out and said, like, that contract was a disaster. Montgomery opted into the second year of the deal. He's going to be paid like $20-some million. They just signed Corbin Burnes. They were looking to trade Montgomery anyway. If the D-backs ate a good chunk of that money, or on the flip side, if the Orioles ate the money, but because of that, they didn't have to send any prospects to Arizona. It was basically like, hey, we'll pay for Montgomery, but we'll send you like a 19-year-old in the DSL who we don't think a whole lot of, and that's the deal. I'm okay with that too, because I think if there may not be a bigger bounce back candidate this year in Major League Baseball than Jordan Montgomery. If you look at everything he'd done in his career with the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the Rangers versus the 1 year in Arizona with the injuries, I tend to believe the stuff from before can come out there. So maybe, yes. And the thing with Montgomery is, even with the bad year last year, if the O's got him right now, I'd slot him right into the number 5 starter. He'd make the Orioles better and he'd be one of their 5 best starters. So if it really doesn't cost much, especially in terms of prospects, I would be interested in a deal like that. Chase with a question, with the improved Dominican presence for the Orioles, why don't the Orioles do the same in Asia? Chase, I believe they're starting to do things like that. And the Tomoyuki Sugano signing to bring him over on a 1-year deal might be the start into fully diving back into professional players in Asia as well, which I think would be a really, really good thing. There's a lot of talent over there for the Orioles moving forward. Let's see. Which players on the Orioles will be all-stars, more or less than last year? What did the Orioles have last year? They had Corbin Burnes, Gunnar Henderson, and Jordan Westburg last year. Am I forgetting anyone? Please let me know in the chat if I'm forgetting anyone. This year, Gunnar Henderson will be an all-star. Grayson Rodriguez will be an all-star. That's 2. Adley Rutschman, well, obviously they had Adley last year as well. Adley Rutschman will be an all-star. That is 3. I'm going to say Westburg doesn't make it this year, but I am going to say that Sir Anthony Dominguez is also an all-star. So I'll give the Orioles 4 all-stars again this year. James with a question, why don't teams avoid drafting Scott Boras clients? You know they're not extending. A lot of times, guys aren't Boras clients when they're drafted and switch over to Boras when they become more established. Sometimes it's the flip-flop. They are Boras clients and they drop him for another client. It's really hard to know at the time of the draft what exactly a player is going to do agent-wise, even though they usually have an agent by that point. It'll change sometimes throughout their career. But I'm sure some teams take that into account if they are Boras clients. But again, the extension is 10 years down the line sometimes when you make that draft pick. So if you're willing to get a good player, who his agent isn't really going to stop you generally from drafting a good player. Walter with a good question here. Your thoughts on how success in a one-year deal impacts the thought of re-signing? I'm thinking more like Jordan Lyles and Kyle Gibson than Corbin Burnes. Do you think both sides walked away happy in those types of scenarios? I do. I think Jordan Lyles loved his time here. I think Kyle Gibson loved his time here. Lyles was pretty much done pitching after that. I mean, he latched on a little bit longer, but Kyle Gibson wanted to go back home. He is from Missouri and he signed with the Cardinals. That was a big thing for him. Now he's a free agent again, so it's interesting what Kyle Gibson will do. But they're also very low stakes deals. You know, those were veteran kind of 4 or 5 starter types, innings eaters that the Orioles brought in. And I do think success on a one-year deal impacts the thought of re-signing. I think liking the culture, the clubhouse, the city, everything has to do with it. And this is something I talked about a little bit over the weekend when I talked about the Corbin Burnes deal. But, you know, Corbin Burnes was such a interesting situation because he just had his sights set on going to Arizona and playing near his family and being able to live at home all year round. But in theory, if the Orioles aren't willing to give out these long-term deals to free agent starting pitchers, maybe, just maybe, you can have this work out where you trade for a guy. You basically force him to play for your organization for 1 or 2 years like they did with Burnes. Everything I've heard is that Corbin Burnes really did love his time in Baltimore and with the Orioles. Just his heart was set on going to Arizona. So that's a special circumstance. But this is my thought with Dylan Cease. Like, maybe you trade for Dylan Cease. He pitches here for 1 year. He has success. The team has success. He likes the organization, the coaches. And he gets his eyes open to like, oh, Baltimore is a worthy destination for me. And even if he doesn't sign an extension during the season, when he hits free agency, he then is hopefully much more open to coming back to Baltimore in that way. I would say that's definitely something that comes up here. Another good question from Hunter. I know we're into the 40 minutes plus here at this point, but hey, last episode of 2024, got a lot of good questions here. Going to try to get to all of them in the mailbag. Chase McDermott, Cade Povich, or Trevor Rogers, if all are healthy and good numbers, who's the first one to make some starts? I'm going to say Cade Povich because right now, if the season started tomorrow, I'm putting Cade Povich as my number 5 starter. And I think if the season started tomorrow, Povich would be in the big leagues and McDermott and Rogers would be in AAA. So by that, I would say Povich would be the first one to get some big league starts. Let's see. Adit with a question here. At what point of inaction does Justin Verlander or Max Scherzer become a priority? Or does Mike Elias potentially is close to having a deal with them that he can quickly pivot to if needed? It would be kind of exciting for the Orioles to obviously bring in a future Hall of Famer in Verlander or Scherzer, but they both had so many injury issues last year. They're both at 40 at this point. I know Verlander's 42. I think Scherzer's 40 at this point. They're not close to the same pitchers they used to be. Would they help the Orioles? Absolutely. Could they come in and be the number 5 starter? Absolutely. And they want to be on winning teams. They want to try and, win some rings before they're all said and done, win some more rings for both of them. I just don't know if you want them to be a priority. Like, yeah, do they make the Orioles better? Of course, but maybe, again, it's more of we can't get the trade done. They're still out there. Let's just go get one of them to make the rotation better. Definitely a possibility, especially with the Houston connection for Verlander with Mike Elias, but I wouldn't say it's top of their mind right now to go get 2 of those guys who could really, truly break down on the mound in 2025 and could be their last years in the big leagues. Hunter with another question. How much do state taxes play a role in free agent signing with teams? They play a big role because depending on the taxes, and you saw it with Corbin Burnes, he's actually going to make more money than he would other places that offered him more money because Arizona has low taxes. And that is, now if deals are very, very close, maybe it can make a little bit of an issue. If deals aren't that close, maybe it's not the biggest thing in the world, but every single player and their financial people take that into account when they are signing these long-term deals. Doug Dimmadome with another question. Out of all of our young talent, who do you think will take the biggest step forward next year? Really, it's going to be Jackson Holliday. I mean, that guy's got such a big step to take forward because it didn't look like a lot last year, and he's got so much talent. There's a reason why he was the number 1 prospect in baseball for a very long time. I'm nowhere close to giving up on Jackson Holliday. I think a huge step is coming forward for him next year. Thank you to Hunter and others, and Arlo and others in the chat. Yeah, of course. How could I forget that Anthony Santander was also an all-star last year because he deserved it, obviously. Let's see. We got a couple more questions in here. We'll get to them. If you have to give up Kobe Mayo, this is a question from 18 Wheel Gang. If you have to give up Kobe Mayo, who do you want more? Dylan Cease or Jared Jones from the Pirates. If I have to give up Kobe Mayo, I'm getting Jared Jones because Dylan Cease has 1 year of team control. Jared Jones has 5 or 6. He's younger. He's not going to be a free agent for a while. And if I'm giving up Mayo, give me Jared Jones. He's got some of the best stuff in all of Major League Baseball. Stephanie with a question. Since the Orioles got Tomoyuki Sugano, do they have a better chance of getting Roki Sasaki? I don't really think so. It's been talked about, like Sugano was asked about it in his press conference, really doesn't have any kind of relationship with Sasaki. They were never teammates in Japan. Like, would it probably be nice if you're coming over from Japan, you have another Japanese player on the team? I'm sure that's helpful, but I don't think it's going to be a big talking point for Sasaki when he is making his choice. Let's see. I'll take Walter's question as the final one of the day. How many home runs do you think Gary Sanchez ends up with? He's got a lot of pop for a backup catcher. That is true. He's not going to play a crazy amount. He'll give Adley the day off. He'll also play against some lefties because he can hit lefties as well. He got about 280 plate appearances last year and hit 11 home runs. The year before, he got about 267 and hit 19 home runs. I'm going to give Gary Sanchez 15 home runs for the Orioles this season. 15 home runs for Gary Sanchez. And you know what? We're talking catcher. So one more question from Hunter. Will we see Samuel Basallo this year? Yes, I think we see him as a DH option in September, making his debut for the Orioles. Thank you so much to everyone who jumped in on this live mailbag. Fantastic live mailbag episode. A whole bunch of great questions. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel if you are here. And remember, if you are a subscriber, we are doing a giveaway here on the show. So you can win, if you're a YouTube subscriber, this Orioles Hawaiian shirt right here. I'm showing in the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. You have to do 2 things to win the Hawaiian shirt. 1, subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. 2, put in the comment section of either today's episode or either of the last 2 episodes your favorite Orioles moment of 2024. We will close submissions at midnight tomorrow night. So we basically close submissions when we cross into the new year. And then I will reveal on Friday's episode who wins the Orioles Hawaiian shirt. So again, right here, subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. This is a thank you to getting me over 8,000 YouTube subscribers. And number 2 is put in the comments your favorite Orioles moment of 2024. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for all the mailbag questions here. I will be back on Wednesday when we open up the new year. I would do my first Orioles opening day roster projection of 2025. I always love starting out the new year with a way too early opening day roster projection. But that does close out 2024. It was an awesome year of the podcast. Obviously, didn't end the best for the Orioles season, but still a great Orioles season in 2024. So much growth here on the show. Thank you to the everydayers out there. Thank you to everyone who stuck around with this show all year. People who have found it in the last couple of months, last couple of weeks, found it today, whatever it may be. I appreciate you all so much for your support for the show. It is a grind, right? I'm doing 3 days a week in the off season, 5 days a week during the year. It's just me. I don't have a producer. I don't have a co-host. I have some guests sometimes, but usually it is just me. It is definitely a grind doing this podcast, but it's certainly a labor of love. And I cannot thank you all enough for another amazing year of Locked On Orioles in 2024. And let's make 2025 even better. And I'll see you in 2025 for the next episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.